Good morning and welcome to the conversation on planetary boundaries and security, co-hosted by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum. My name is Eric White. I head climate adaptation and resilience at the World Economic Forum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to this conversation. We've got a really distinguished panel, but before we start, a short note of context. Something that we do every year at the World Economic Forum is produce something called the Global Risks Report. This is a really broad survey of various types of stakeholders, thousands and thousands, that seeks to identify the most critical risks faced by humanity in terms of severity on the 2-year and the 10-year time horizon. And this year, like in the past several years, on the 10-year time horizon, almost all of the top risks were environmental. And they actually went beyond climate change. They included things like biodiversity collapse and ecosystem loss, scarcity of natural resources. So if you look at them as a totality, what they reflect is a sense that the physical systems of the Earth are not going to continue functioning the way that they have for millennia. And that's actually a scary thing. So from our survey, it's almost like a red alarm bell going off, because this is happening year after year. But when we engage communities whose job is to manage risks, we often find that the mind share devoted to these issues is relatively minimal. And that occurs in financial supervisors, that's companies, it's the security community. And some of this is understandable, right? There's more pressing near-term things. But we still think these risks are clear and present enough that they need to be elevated. So with the Nature Security Nexus, what we're doing in the forum is we've convened something we call a Global Future Council. This is a fancy term for an expert group that's working on better understanding and elevating these risks. And in this case, we want to constructively engage with the security sector. So here we are. First example of this. Working together with the World Bank, we've put this together today. And we're also working on a series of scenario exercises that will be run on these issues. The first will be in Asia later this year. Happy to talk to you about that afterwards, if you like. So that's enough background. To kick us off, I'm very happy that we have a member of this council here today to moderate us. Sharon Burke is president of the consultancy Ecospherics. She's co-founder of the Eco Security Council. She's a former assistant secretary of defense in the United States, and very glad that she's here with us today. Sharon.
Thank you, Eric. It is a delight to be here to moderate this panel. And as Eric indicated, I'm a former U.S. defense official, and so I'm very familiar with how that community calculates risk. You heard about how the World Economic Forum does it. Well, the Department of Defense in the United States, it's a little bit of math, and it's a little bit of history, and a lot of creativity and imagination. And it's not just a point of interest. It's not just a report. This, of course, is a number that guides the organizing, training, and equipping for the force, and also a defense budget of almost $900 billion, which, by the way, is not 5% of the U.S. GDP. So, but what we're here to talk about today is a different kind of risk. It is not a risk. It is more science and evidence than it is military art. So a group of scientific experts, including Johan Rockström, who is part of our council, calculated planetary boundaries. So what is the carrying capacity of the Earth? Air, land, oceans, water, fresh water, atmosphere. How much can you put in terms of pollution, additives? How much can you take out and still be within the safe operating space for Earth? So what they've found is that at this point, we are in breach of 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. This is not a good thing, to say the least. What that means is that we are approaching tipping points. And all of these boundaries are connected to each other, so it's not just that you breach the boundary for biodiversity. That affects freshwater, that affects climate change. They're all connected. Being in breach means that we're getting close to these tipping points, at which point we see irreversible damage and potentially really catastrophic outcomes for humanity, for the ecosystems we depend on. That's where we are, and the security implications of this, as you might expect, are rather extreme. They range from more unrest to more conflict, to more forced migration, to just human suffering. That's where we are. This is a dangerous point for humanity, and it is about security, even if it's not on the main stage at this event. But we are so fortunate today to have this wonderful council of leaders to come up to the stage to talk to us about this and about the state of the planet, what it means to be on a sick planet. As Johan Rockstrom said, we're a sick patient that's in critical condition, what it means to have a sick planet, what it means for security more specifically. So I'd like to invite the panel to the stage, and then I'll introduce them to you. We'll have a conversation, and if we have time, we'll have a few questions from the audience. First, Axel von Trotsenburg, if you'd like to sit here. President Santos, Deputy Prime Minister, and then, of course, Minister Al-Jubeir. And I will introduce you all now. Let you get settled for just a moment. So first, let me introduce Axel von Trotsenburg, who is, as Eric said, is a co-host today of this event. So we really appreciate that. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Dr. von Trotsenburg is the Senior Managing Director of the World Bank. And in that position, he oversees the bank's, all of the bank's work. Let's see if I get it right here, Dr. von Trotsenburg. People, planet, prosperity, digital, and infrastructure. So he has a very long history of mobilizing a huge amount of money, of financing for the world's greatest development challenges. And you should know that, of course, last year that was, I think, about $90 billion. Yes. Next, we have Juan Manuel Santos, who is the chair of the elders and is the former president of Colombia. In his time in office in Colombia, he not only was a primary champion for the UN's development goals, he also was recognized for his leadership on climate change and biodiversity. And of course, he settled a 50-year civil war, the longest conflict in the Western Hemisphere, which he was recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize for that signal achievement. Then we have the Deputy Prime Minister of the federal government of Somalia, Salah Ahmed Jama, who has been in that position since August of 2022. I have to call out something in your bio. You'll have to forgive me, but I noticed that you studied at Carleton University and you taught there and you were a researcher there, and you also studied there. So that's something you have in common. And also my niece did. So it's a wonderful American institution. So I had to recognize that. But of course, you returned to the land of your birth and became a force in rebuilding governing capacity in Somalia. You have done everything from electoral systems to policing to the social safety net to climate change. We're happy to have you here today. And then we have the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Minister Al-Jubeir, who has been instrumental in shaping foreign policy for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for its international affairs, including with my own country, which I'm very grateful for, and is also the climate envoy for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So we're delighted to have you today here, sir, Mr. Minister. So let's get started. Axel, as the host, I wanted to start with you to ask you, why did you agree to co-host this? Like, why does the World Bank think that this question of planetary health is important, and how are you acting on it at the bank?
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. I don't think that actually the co-host idea is so important, but actually why are we also as a World Bank here at the Security Conference? Traditionally, this was a security matter in a narrow sense. But what you're seeing when you do development work, you see very clearly the devastation of the fragile and conflict-affected countries, but you see also the effects of climate change and the devastating effect that natural catastrophes have caused, also largely through climate change, and the effects that those are having on people and creating conflict. And you can no longer delink that, and it has been a necessary nexus that is being increasingly recognized, but we have not been very good at coping with it. Same with the fragile countries that we talked. There is a nexus with humanitarian and security. And I think it is very important that a security conference is attacking this problem, is basically to see, look, how do we deal in for example, Sahel zone with desertification issues. I think this was one of the reasons why we were so pleased that Saudi Arabia put the desertification cap on this to highlight that this is not a minor issue, it's a major issue, and it affects probably more than 100 million people. So that is where we need to actually to focus. We see this also in our work, and I think we need to discuss the awareness that it exists. Secondly, we will actually have to do something about this, and I can talk more about that, about what the World Bank is doing. But it is very important that we identify these issues, that they are consequential. When people are talking about issues about migration, and it is very prominent here, well, here is one aspect that has this is a direct reflection. Migration doesn't just come just for the sake of this. There are reasons for it, and what we are seeing, that climate change, a loss of biodiversity, loss of the destruction of food systems have a direct impact on people's lives, and unfortunately causes people to either flee their homes, although they didn't want to, or it even worse, it can cause conflict. So therefore we wanted to do this together with the World Economic Forum, because we thought this is a good way of also putting a critically important issue for us in the development field, but I think also a critically important topic to be discussed in the security area.
Thank you so much. President Santos, I very much want to ask you about your time as head of state, but first maybe talk to us about your current role as the chair of the elders. What are the elders doing in this space? What are they interested in? And specifically with the planetary boundaries, the security implications?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. This is a subject that I am very close to. The elders, well, as you probably know, founded by Nelson Mandela, and we don't have an agenda different than humanity, and we defend human rights. We're not for winning wars, but for preventing and ending wars. And we are right now very much engaged in 4 different issues that we have identified as very important to address. The one is climate change. Second is nuclear disarmament. The third is pandemics. And the fourth is AI. And there's a coincidence. Just a month ago, as chair of the elders, I was invited to unveil something called the Doomsday Clock, which was invented after the Second World War by Einstein and Oppenheimer. They went to the University of Chicago and asked a group of scientists to monitor the development of their invention, because they were very much afraid of what their invention could do to the planet. Well, these scientists created a clock called the Doomsday Clock, and for every year the scientists get together and move the clock. Is the risk increasing or decreasing? And it has been moving for 75 years. A month ago, we unveiled the clock, and it's now 89 seconds to doomsday, the closest ever. And I asked the scientists why, and they said because the risk of a nuclear war has increased tremendously because of the number of nuclear warheads and the technology, but they added climate change, they added AI as an existential threat. So it's very much connected to what you're doing, and the elders, we are then working on those issues.
So 89 seconds to doomsday. Okay. That's probably not the last bit of bad news we'll have on this panel, but we will get to good news as well, I hope. But Deputy Prime Minister Jama, let me ask you, what we've heard from both of our colleagues so far is about the way that environmental crisis and security come together, including on it towards doomsday. But this is very real in Somalia. This is, and very public worldwide knowledge that this is the life that people are living in Somalia. Could you talk about what it looks like for you from your country?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here to this very important forum platform at a very important time. To begin with, the Munich Security Council was traditionally supposed to be a transatlantic security platform. But as you can see on this panel, it seems neither Europe nor North America can have an isolated conversation about their security and the interconnectedness of security in its different dimensions brings us all here, from South America to Asia and Africa, which means some of the threats that we face are interlinked with the threats that others face. And this common challenge should all help us to develop common perspectives and hopefully common solutions. Somalia is at the front line of insecurity related to climate. Perhaps many people would watch their televisions and often see the Somali government and the Somali people fighting off the likes of Al-Shabaab and ISIS. And to bring good news to this platform is we are about to win the war against those two eminent threats. But underlying these, few thousand young men carrying AK-47s and explosives that we intend to defeat very soon are some more very serious insecurity-related issues in Somalia, the Horn of Africa, and the Sahel regions and the whole African continent, small islands. And that is the insecurity and the challenge that come from climate change impact and environmental degradation. So as scientists gathered in Stockholm, some 2009 and 15, and we have the scientific evidence here that the framework of planetary boundaries tells us that the world cannot continue to carry the amount of pollution and degradation and destruction we're causing, and it will affect our life. The Somali nomad and the Somali farmer has been able to observe that there is something terribly wrong with the environment and the climate. As we experience one drought and flood after the other, somehow, most of the development actors would want to talk about community resilience, societal resilience. But I must bring to your attention that some of these impacts are beyond the capacity of the average community in terms of scale and scope, in terms of frequency and impact. So right now, Somalia is trying to develop a national development plan in the name of National Transformation Plan. And we're focusing on traditional development goals, sustainable development goals, economic growth indicators, GDP and whatnot. But we're increasingly coming to realize we cannot continue down that path without factoring in the planetary frameworks, biodiversity, the coral reefs in our seas, the agriculture, the livestock that is replenishing. And these are all interconnected. Often in global platforms like the climate COP platforms, we talk about climate in isolation from other things. And we appreciate the likes of the World Bank that work very closely with us are factoring in this framework that helps us to take a more comprehensive look at development challenge. So my takeaway point is, for countries like Somalia that are dealing with fragility and underdevelopment, a discourse on planetary frameworks and the threats that arise from there is a discourse on our future development. We cannot continue as per the previous models, and we appreciate this discussion and thank the views expressed by others. And it's a learning opportunity for us. Thank you. I spoke a bit way too much for.
No, that was perfect. And thank you for bringing in the comprehensive picture, because I think that is the very difficult on both the risk side and the solution side, which we'll get to. Mr. Al-Jubeir, you've been very passionate about desertification and about land degradation, particularly for the countries in your region. I've heard you speak about it, and Axel mentioned it. Could you talk a little bit about that and also what the security implications are? Although I also see from your expression that you may have something else you want to put on the table. So, but I know that that's been a subject that you've been very influential on.
thank you very much. It's great to be here. And the advantage of speaking after the distinguished speakers is they covered all the ground, so I can just pontificate. So I think there's nothing that any of us do not agree on. The issue of climate and environment in general has been dominated by emotions and trying to score political points, and hypocrisy and contradictions, and there's not enough science, logic, and can-do attitude. So this is a point that we've tried to make to the world. When it comes to the issue of climate, we have 3 COPs. We have the climate COP that everybody is aware of, which unfortunately has become a Christmas tree that everybody attaches everything to, and we lose track of what it is we're trying to do. The Earth COP, which is COP16 that Saudi Arabia hosted and Saudi Arabia has the presidency of, is viewed as the desert COP. Nobody paid attention to it because they figure we don't have a desert. Only North Africa and the Middle East do. So therefore, it's not my problem. Well, it is your problem because the desertification has a direct impact on atmospherics in the North Atlantic, on the severity and frequency of hurricanes in the Caribbean. It has an impact on marine life. It has an impact on oceans, which have a direct impact on climate, which has an impact on everything that is associated with our lives. The other part of it is the impact of security. When you have desertification, people move to where there is food. Chances are people live there. You have conflict, you have bloodshed, you have violence, you have extremism, you have terrorism, you have refugees, you have migration, and they end up in other countries. And that impacts the politics of those countries, which could be far removed from the original area, and leads to extremist politics. So I tell people, if you are concerned about extremist politics in some European countries, there's a direct line to what's happening in Africa. Because of migration, because of wars, we are worried about what's happening in Sudan, and we pay a lot of attention, devote a lot of resources to a conflict that has been raging for decades. The beginnings of it are very simple: drought, not enough water in Darfur, caused the herders to come into the farming areas, conflict, bloodshed, violence, retribution, and before you know it, the country is in a war that has lasted decades. We point out that you can restore land very effectively and very profitably. The United Nations numbers are, for every dollar you invest in land restoration, the returns are between 7 and 20-fold. So this is like investing in NVIDIA or Microsoft. Plus it saves lives, plus it makes our lives better. So we have also trying to make the point, which was made earlier, that climate is not about climate, and desertification is not about deserts, and biodiversity is not about biodiversity. It's also about our security. And if we deal with those issues at the outset, we can deal with it fairly inexpensively and fairly effectively, and avoid paying a tremendous cost in terms of blood and treasure as a consequence of not dealing with those issues. So that's why we are very pleased that this issue is becoming part of the global security agenda, and we believe that the focus on it from that perspective, saving lives, avoiding conflict, would provide for a better world than if we just ignored it and looked at it as an environmental issue that's out there. This is really fundamental to war and peace.
I'm smiling just because I appreciate that you laid out the case for what we're here to talk about so eloquently.
Can I make a comment on what the Minister said? Because you mentioned quite rightly 3 COPs. No? We have been advocating that they merge into 1 COP. We have COP30 in Brazil next year. 30 COPs, and we are not better off. COP16 about biodiversity was held in my country. The results for biodiversity were nil. And we need to change the way we address these problems, and merging the 3 COPs and relating it to security. I was invited by the UAE when they were presiding the Security Council to go and convince the Security Council to get involved with climate. because of a very simple, common sense argument. The Security Council was created to defend peace, to promote peace, to avoid conflict. Climate change is generating conflict. We have right now more than 130 conflicts, 130, many of them fed by climate change. Therefore, the Security Council should get involved with climate. Unfortunately, some countries vetoed that. But I think this is an issue, very important issue, merging the three COPs and getting the Security Council involved in climate.
Yeah, I think there have been attempts, as you say, but there's a couple of holdouts that have consistently vetoed that, and there may be a new one on that. You know, this is a governance challenge too, like putting all these COPs together, putting all these issues together. That's not how governments, that's not even how our institutions are structured. We do, you know, one thing at a time. Could you tell us a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you a very similar question, Deputy Prime Minister, so brace yourself. How did you know, when you're in a war, and particularly a civil war that was so painful and difficult, it's right here, and you can't see past it. And if you can't settle that war and deal with that war, there's not time for anything else. So how did you make time to put nature and development on the table while you were fighting a war?
Well, I'll tell you a story about that, which is an interesting story. The day I was sworn in Congress as president, the 7th of August, 2010, that morning, I went to the oldest indigenous community in the whole of the Western Hemisphere, the one who has maintained the pre-Hispanic culture the best, called the Kogis, in a very remote and beautiful area in Colombia called the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. I went to recognize them as our older brothers and ask them for their permission to go to Congress and be sworn in. The governors, the chiefs, had me waiting for about an hour, and then they said, okay, we give you our blessing, and we give you a baton of authority, but you have a mandate. Make peace with the FARC, with the guerrillas, stop the war, but you have to make peace with nature. Otherwise, there will never be peace among humans. Okay. And you come back when you finish, and you give us your results. 8 years later, July of 2018, I went back to them, very proud, with the peace agreement with the FARC and with the SDGs that the United Nations had approved unanimously, 150 countries. And I said, the mandate is fulfilled. Here are the two proofs. They said to me, Mr. President, we will read them, come back in 1 week. I went back in a week.
Tough
and
crowd.
they said, listen, the peace with the FARC is perfect. And that's why you won the Nobel Peace Prize. But the SDGs, there's a very most critical factor lacking. And I said to him, but what could be lacking if we negotiated among 150 countries, everybody agreed on the 17 SDGs? I said, no, stop there. The spiritual factor is lacking, and that is why the world is having so many conflicts. The harmony between mankind and nature is still not being resolved. On the contrary, it's getting more and more difficult because the spiritual factor is not present. And I said, and what is the spiritual factor? And they said to me, until humans don't understand and feel that nature has life, that oceans have life, that mountains have life, that rivers have life, and they have a right, and they are considered at the same level as the humans, there will not be peace with nature. And they said, and conflicts will continue to increase until the humans understand this. I was very impressed by the argument. It's a very strong argument, and I'm now more and more believing that that is something that we have to convince humanity to treat nature in a different way. And that's what we're doing with the Planetary Guardians. I am vice chair of the something called the Planetary Guardians. Johan Brockstrom is one of our sort of scientific leaders.
Yeah.
And we are trying in every way possible to send that message that we have to treat nature in a different way.
Johan is a busy man, as are you. Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister, I wanted to ask you, let's turn the corner a little bit and I'll pose similar questions, and especially for you, Dr. von Trotsenburg. The world sees, you know, as you said, the difficulties of Somalia with Al-Shabaab and ISIS and floods and droughts. But that's not the whole story of a country. It never is. And as a people, can you talk to us maybe about some of the successes that you see and what makes you hopeful? Both the resilience of the Somali people, the ways that the world is supporting. Where is there positive stories that you could share with us?
Well, there is always a need for a positive story. Let me begin with, as the president,
Please.
The head of elders was talking about his encounter with the people who are at peace with nature. It made me to reflect on the ways the Somalis used to lead their life. Before the state failure, it was a very common practice for everybody in the city going to school or working to spend at least a couple of months in the countryside and go to, because traditionally everybody came from the countryside. So we would leave big cities like Mogadishu and go back to small, towns and other places. But now there is only one trend of movement in terms of migration. People are just constantly moving away from their rural areas to the big cities. And I met a gentleman who did research on the future of Africa, and I was very surprised when he told me that the major problems of the African countries is going to be urban problems, because nobody is going to be left in the rural areas. So a very unhealthy and speedy process of urbanization, because people are unable to live at peace with nature in the rural areas. Let me begin with a few positive stories that we have, quite a number of them actually. In the 90s and early 2000s, the world knew Somalia as the land that produced pirates. And as I had a discussion prior to this meeting with the Saudi foreign minister, the world only saw the final product, not the process that produced that. A process in which the wealth of the Somali people and their seas was stolen and taken away. A process in which a poor, ill-equipped fishermen could not compete with illegal huge vessels that were not only taking away the fish, but also destroying the ecosystem, the coral reefs and the mangroves of our coast. That problem has been resolved now. But we still continue to face challenges. But let me focus on the positive ones. Somalia has completed the HIPC initiative, where $5.5 billion of debt has been forgiven after going through a very serious process. Somalia now is focusing on winning the war against Al-Shabaab. But despite these positive gains, we still have governance and development challenges and the meeting of sustainable development goals. As we recover new land, and we are forced to provide stability and access to social services to hundreds of thousands of Somalis. And there are always budgetary constraints that we face, because we're unable to come up with the necessary resources to provide full services. And we thank the World Bank and the IDA programs for really filling a gap there. Furthermore, at this current time, we are working on massive projects that will help us to revive the rangelands and traditional grazing lands that our economy, the livestock that we export. Saudi is one of our biggest markets. We export about 5 to 6 million livestock. We have 60 million livestock. So the Somalis that you see being helped at the times of droughts are not traditionally poor people. They're very proud, rich, and resilient people. But the developments around the world render their lives stagnant, destroy their earnings, their wealth, their ways of life, their traditions are threatened by the excess pollutions and other things happening elsewhere. Nevertheless, Somalia now is part of the Security Council, a member of the Security Council. That used to be a table, we used to be on the menu that time, where decisions were taken for us in faraway places. Somalia is part of the East African Economic Community now. Through the World Bank, we hope to work on the Horn of Africa initiative for access to gateways. And we're locating at a very strategic place in Africa. With peace and development, we can be a gateway to the rest of Africa. And we have a long-lasting traditional trading relationships with the Arabian Gulf, with Asia and elsewhere. So there's a lot of positive news. But let me conclude with this. As we try to work on our national development plan, as we try to develop sectoral policies on water, on energy, on agriculture, livestock, trade, a sudden, and now not even so sudden, but constant reoccurrence of climatic crisis render our efforts useless. So we have to move away from our normal ways of planning to crisis prevention and response to. So early warning systems, awareness programs, investment, heavy investment that we don't have, frankly speaking, is needed. For instance, resolving water issue, either Sudan or Somalia or the Sahel. At the root cause of our crisis is lack of water management, not necessarily absence of water. And that needs massive infrastructure projects that are not coming easily in today's world.
That is a perfect segue to our next speakers. I want to, Mr. Minister, ask you something, and then Axel, I think we'll end where we started with you and have a big picture conversation. What I'd like to ask you is first of all, what your government is doing on the things you mentioned and that you've heard from the other speakers, but also, I'm curious, you're very influential in international diplomatic circles, very, and how are you able to persuade other countries, including my own, about the primacy of these issues? So it'd be interesting to hear both of those from you, if you don't mind.
Well, to begin with, in Saudi Arabia, we are either Bedouins or farmers or merchants. And you can't be successful at either one of those three if you are not practical and pragmatic. You have to be able to tell the difference between a mirage and the real thing in order to survive in our climate. So we're practical people, we're pragmatic people, we're non-ideological people. We know we have a problem globally. We know that temperatures are rising. We know that climate is changing. We know that we need to work very hard in order to bend the curve so that our survival depends on it. We believe that we can do this by actually doing rather than by talking and screaming and pointing blame. I can point to Canada, one of the countries most vocal on the environment, and I can say you've become the second or third largest polluter last year. Not because of forest fires. The war in Ukraine contributed to carbon. The war in Gaza contributed to carbon. Methane from animals contributes to carbon. Gas from cars, pollution from coal contributes to carbon. Industry contributes to carbon. So it's not one thing, it's everything. And the way we deal with it is not by pointing fingers and being hypocritical, where in the European continent they would tax oil at 200% in the name of the environment, while at the same time subsidizing coal, which is a worse polluter. So let's be serious here. So anyway, you can tell I feel strongly about these issues. But the way you fix it is by example. We have launched programs in Saudi Arabia that start from preserving land. We used to have 1% of our territory protected 10 years ago. Now we're at almost 20%. In 5 years, we'll be at 30%, both land and water. What we are seeing the impact of it. We have less sandstorms, and we have the ability to store wildlife has increased. So that's a positive. We are working on carbon capture. We have more than 60 initiatives in Saudi Arabia. We're devoting $180 billion to fund those initiatives. And so we're doing things, not talking about it. We broadened that to the Middle East by launching a Middle East Green Initiative that includes roughly 25 countries to show countries how they can use what we call a circular carbon economy approach, how you can do things like design your cities better, build more efficient plants, have better standards, traffic, protected areas, turn waste into energy, use of water, all of these. And we want to make sure that countries in our region are able to do this. It's profitable, as I mentioned. We're dealing with reversing desertification, increasing plant life, planting so that we increase the food supply, reduce tensions, and generate prosperity. This is important to our region and important to us. We want to be a modern society connected to the world. We want to be prosperous. We want to be innovative. And it's much easier for us to do this if we don't have to deal with the problems around us in our region. And many of those problems are driven by issues that relate to climate and drought and desertification. So we do this. On a global level, we launched the Global Water Organization in order to be able to bring clean water to the greatest number of people. We're part of the Methane Pledge, and on and on. The list is large. You can find it online. I don't have to tell you. Okay. But our point is we need to be able to work constructively together to do this. It's not about scoring points. We either all win or we all lose. There are no winners or losers in this. And I agree with His Excellency about the 3 COPs. We have advocated that we need to bring them together because they all deal with the same challenge from a different perspective. And you can't deal with the challenge without all the 3 perspectives coming together. It's even gotten confused. We hosted COP16, and some of my countrymen would say, shouldn't we be COP 30 because COP 29 is in Azerbaijan? And I go, no, it's a different COP. Then they hear about COP 16 in Colombia, and they tell me, aren't we hosting it? So I say, I see where you're getting from, but it got so confused because they took off on tangents, and it seems to me they may have lost their way in terms of what it is we're trying to achieve. We're trying to get the world to focus on a challenge, on a problem, by working together, not pointing blame, not pointing fingers, and being scientific about it in order to solve this problem. The topic we have today about the link between it and security is important because we want to show people that this is not about desert countries. This is not about industrial countries. This has a direct impact on our security and our well-being so that we give it the attention it needs and treat it like the national security issue that it is.
Thank you. And maybe later you and I can talk about how you might engage in diplomacy with other countries. Not that I have anyone in mind. We're just out of time, but I wanted to give you the last word, Dr. Van Trotsenburg, because the World Bank is the ultimate big picture organization, and you are a very big picture person. When you look at all of this and all of the ways that the World Bank is engaged, what needs to happen, what else needs to happen, who else needs to move, what do you see coming down the road?
Look, there are many challenges we have identified. I also believe we need to convince the world that we can solve problems, and it's doable. And I just wanted to say one example is, for example, on the ozone layer, the Montreal Protocol. We actually administered this, but it was done. And this is important, as small it may have been. But I think we need also to say there are things that are doable, and we need to act on this. I also believe what some of all you say is we need to have much greater focus. We're getting really confusing with all sorts of numbers, and nobody knows anymore. But we should also be then accountable and do a few things, but do it. Instead of that, you have 50-page declarations where nobody knows what should be done. And the world gets cynical, and they check out. I think that we need to also to keep in mind, you mentioned the SDGs. The SDGs are hopelessly off track. Less than 20% has been achieved. Yet actually a lot more can be done. What we believe is that for developing countries, it's very important that we don't gang up on them, that we work with them, and that we also recognize that these challenges, particularly on climate and so, is not in isolation. We started actually doing that we say we do country, climate, and development reports. You cannot just link just because particularly in the West, people feel very strongly about climate, so that is the only issue in an African country. That is just plain wrong. You need to embed that in a development area. In fact, if you look at adaptation finance, most is development financing. And we should have a sharp focus on this. I think that also what we need to say is we need to stay committed to this, to the countries. There is a lot of withdrawal effect. And that is, and I think that is concerning. The World Bank has been successful to scale a lot. But what I often say is, well, we do much more, but if others do less, then there is no cumulative additionality. And I think we need actually to see how everybody can do more. And that is, by the way, not limited only to governments to see what you can do. We need to get much better the private sector involved. And it is difficult, but that doesn't mean that we should check out on this. And here I really think we need to have these kind of things embedded. What does it for the world mean for the World Bank is when we are dealing with climate, when we're dealing with biodiversity, that cannot be a separate cute as, oh, well, we need to do that and click the box. You need to DNA it in your operations. That means if you do adaptation finance, that you actually, from the concept, you actually look at that and you put that into that operation. The other one where we all are not good at is we need to be focused then at the outcomes, because too much is being declared and nothing is then otherwise achieved. But we need also to show that things can be done. And I think that is a much sharper results orientation, because when people see, hey, they did it actually well done. For example, climate smart agriculture with drip agriculture. You can make incredible headways. And so it's not all rocket science, but we need to show that it can be done. I would say that the challenge, if you look at the long term, is clearly, in my mind, for the low-income countries, particularly in Africa. The African population will double. If you are looking at, by 2050, like a third of the world youth is in Africa, and if they don't find jobs, we have a problem, but we have to do this well. Similarly on urbanization, I've worked long on in East Asia. There, if you do urbanization well, it can be a really motor for growth and job creation. If it is chaotically done, it is a recipe for poverty. And so what we have huge challenges on this, and they need to be combined with environmental and climate smart solutions. And again, what we need to make sure is that here the entire world community stays engaged. This is not a time to disengage. It is really an important one that we can do it. I happen to be much more of an optimist, also because people get very depressed on all the things. I just wanted to say, look, when you are looking, and the president just said he got a Nobel Prize. There was also a Nobel Prize winner called Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish economist. He wrote a book in the 60s about Asia, Asian drama. Asia could not develop, was condemned to the eternal catastrophe, corruption, could not develop. Please look where East Asia is today. I think things can be done. And I think we should also sometimes embrace a more positive picture, because for particularly planetary boundaries, we cannot use a defeatist approach. If that is you cannot get anything. It can be done. And again, I would say the Montreal Protocol is a good case. Cooperation, international cooperation matters, and there we need to actually work hard on, including multilateralism. Thank you.
That's a perfect note to end on. The Montreal Protocol, in fact, that is one of the planetary boundaries we are not in breach of because of the success of that effort. So that's a great note to end on. I want to thank you all very much for what was a wonderful discussion, and let's give the panel a hand.